The wind carried dust across the scorched ground of the Dakota frontier as Clara Remington stood at the edge of her property, black veil whipping against her cheek. The funeral was over. The neighbors had left. But the silence was louder now, pressing against her ribs like a curse. Her husband, Samuel, had died just a week prior, kicked in the head by a startled horse. A clean, brutal death. Fitting, perhaps, for a man who never softened his voice even in love. The other settlers had come out of obligation, murmuring their prayers and giving Clara their pity in tight-lipped glances. "You're young," one had said. "You'll find someone else soon." As if a man could be replaced as easily as a broken tool. But Clara hadn't cried. Not for Samuel, not even when she lowered him into the earth. She'd done what was expected, wore black, bowed her head, nodded when spoken to. But inside, something was shifting. Something had cracked open in her, a breathless kind of clarity she hadn't felt since before the marriage. That evening, she walked the border of her land, rifle slung over her shoulder, skirts soaked with dust. The horizon blazed red, and the plains whispered with secrets. She had grown up on this land, knew it like her own skin. But now, alone, every sound seemed louder, every shadow longer. Coyotes howled in the distance. The wind stirred the tall grasses like ghostly fingers. She paused at the tree line, where a small clearing dipped down to the river. And there, like something summoned by thought alone, stood a figure. He sat on a painted horse, tall and motionless, a Cheyenne. He did not reach for a weapon, he only watched her. She gripped her rifle, her heart thudded. Her neighbors would say, "Shoot first," but she did not raise the gun. He nodded once, a quiet, respectful gesture, and turned, riding away into the dusk without a word. Clara stood there long after he was gone. The rifle trembled in her hands. She had expected fear. But what bloomed in her chest was something else. Something dangerous. Not fear, not grief, curiosity. By the next morning, the prairie sun had bleached the sky a hard, endless blue, and Clara Remington was already back at work, splitting logs behind the house. The black of her morning dress was now streaked with sweat and wood dust, her sleeves rolled up, her arms aching. She preferred the pain. It was something she could control. But she wasn't alone for long. By mid-morning, the first of the neighbors arrived. Mrs. Alcott, with her tight curls and tighter suspicions, appeared with a pie and an arsenal of questions disguised as concern. "You shouldn't be out here alone," she said, setting the pie down like an offering to a god she feared. "There are stories, Clara, sightings of Indians near the river, men riding too close to the settlements." Clara nodded politely, but her thoughts drifted. She hadn't told anyone about the man on the horse, the Cheyenne. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because she hadn't been afraid. Maybe because the look in his eyes hadn't been cruel. It had been calm, curious, measured, not what the stories warned of. "You'll need to start thinking about protection," Mrs. Alcott continued. "Maybe that Higgins boy. He's got a good arm and his own mule." Clara's stomach turned at the suggestion, but she only smiled. "I can take care of myself." It wasn't bravado. It was truth. That night, after the neighbors had gone and the fire had burned low, Clara walked the edge of the property again. The moonlight made the prairie shimmer like water. She paused near the same clearing. Nothing. Empty. She waited a little longer. Nothing stirred. But as she turned to leave, she spotted it, just beyond the edge of the trees, a small bundle wrapped in animal hide. She knelt to inspect it. Inside was a pouch of dried meat, a handful of berries, and a carved bone pendant shaped like a bird in flight. A gift. From him. She clutched it, her heart pounding with something she couldn't name. No settler man had ever left her a gift without expectation. No settler had ever seen her like this. Strong, alone, standing on her own land. She looked toward the woods, the silence echoing louder than words. Something had begun, and Clara felt it in her bones. It wasn't grief. It wasn't madness. It was the first flutter of change. 3 nights later, the Cheyenne returned. Clara sensed him before she saw him. The way the coyotes quieted, the breeze shifted, the world stilled for something sacred. She stood on the porch with her rifle in hand, though she made no move to lift it. The man rode out from the trees, slowly, deliberately. The same painted horse, the same quiet presence. But this time he stopped closer. Close enough that she could see the beadwork on his tunic, the feathers braided into his hair, the steady dark eyes that held neither apology nor demand. They watched each other for a long moment. 2 people separated by language, culture, and 100 unspoken rules. Finally, he dismounted, stepping lightly onto her land as if it were sacred ground. Clara's grip on the rifle tightened instinctively, but she did not lift it. The man raised both hands, palms open. "Wovoka," he said softly, tapping his chest. She stared. "Your name?" He nodded once. She pointed to herself. "Clara." His eyes narrowed slightly, repeating, "Clara." The way he said it, like it mattered. He reached into a pouch at his side and withdrew a piece of soft leather. Upon it, he drew a rough shape in the dirt with his finger. A bird, wings spread. Then he pointed to the carved pendant she had kept near her heart since he left it. Clara touched it lightly, then nodded. Understanding flickered between them. This was no ordinary encounter. It wasn't barter. It wasn't intimidation. It was communication. Wovoka stepped back, then reached into his pouch again, pulling out a slender, hollow reed. He pressed it to his lips and played a slow, haunting note. The sound was soft and low, winding through the grass like a whispered story. When he finished, he bowed his head once, then turned and mounted his horse. Without another word, he rode into the darkness. Clara stood on the porch, her heart hammering. She had not moved, had not spoken. But something had changed. A boundary had been crossed, not one of land, but of soul. The silence he left behind rang louder than any gunshot. For the first time since Samuel's death, she felt alive. Not safe, not comfortable, but undeniably, gloriously alive. The following morning brought a thick haze that hung low across the prairie like a warning. Clara woke to the smell of smoke, not from her hearth, but drifting in from the east. She climbed the rise behind her cabin, eyes scanning the horizon. A black ribbon curled into the sky beyond the ridge, far enough not to threaten her directly, but close enough to rattle her bones. Fire, or worse, trouble. The settlers often blamed the Cheyenne for every spark, every missing calf, every broken fence. Tensions had been mounting for months. Her gift from Wovoka still lay on the table where she'd set it the night before, the carved bird catching the early light. She stared at it now, feeling torn between 2 worlds. Her neighbors would expect her to report the visit, to say she'd seen a Cheyenne on her land. But she didn't. She couldn't. Not when the air around his presence had felt safer than the pointed prayers and veiled judgments of those who shared her language and skin. By mid-morning, riders arrived. 3 men, neighbors, faces tense, rifles strapped to their saddles. One of them, Jack Langley, had once courted her before she married Samuel. Now he looked at her as though she were something fragile, left too long in the sun. "Smoke near Willow Creek," he said without preamble. "You seen anything? Any movement? Any Signs? Clara shook her head. No, she said simply, and it was mostly the truth. Jack didn't believe her. She saw it in his eyes, but he didn't push. You should come stay with the Langleys, safer with folks. Clara met his gaze. I'm not leaving my home. The other men exchanged glances, but none argued. As they rode off, Clara's hands trembled, not with fear, but with fury. She was tired of being told what safety looked like, tired of being looked at like a lamb waiting for slaughter. That night, she waited again on the porch, the rifle beside her. She didn't know if Wovoka would come. But if he did, she had questions. Not about what he wanted. She didn't think he meant harm. But about what this was. This unspoken thread tying their paths together. And when he did appear, as silent as ever, stepping from the darkness into the moonlight, she stood to meet him. This time, she walked to the edge of her land. And she crossed it. The earth was damp beneath Clara's boots as she stepped beyond the fence line for the first time since she was a child. She moved carefully, not out of fear, but reverence. This was no longer just prairie. It had become a space between worlds, and tonight it felt sacred. Wovoka stood near the same copse of trees as before, his posture relaxed, arms at his sides. His horse waited quietly nearby, as if trained to sense mood instead of commands. Clara stopped a few paces away. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, she did something she hadn't expected of herself. She removed the pendant from around her neck and extended it toward him. He stepped forward slowly, took it in his hand, studied it, then returned it to her. You keep, he said softly. His voice was deep, calm, with an accent shaped by a language older than the soil. She nodded, slipping it back around her neck. Why did you leave it? She asked. He tilted his head, considering. Gift, he said. Respect. She didn't know how to respond. No man had ever spoken that word to her without some hidden, barbed hook beneath it. I didn't tell anyone, she said after a pause, about you. Wovoka nodded once. He looked toward the horizon where the last glow of twilight was fading. Soon, he said, others come. Not kind. Her stomach tightened. Settlers? He hesitated, then shook his head. Soldiers. The word struck her like a stone to the chest. Why? He didn't answer at first. Then, land, water, power. He gestured toward the sky, then the ground. They take, always take. Clara swallowed hard. The fire in the east, the nervous riders, it was coming. And yet here they stood, two people from opposing worlds, not with guns, but with words, with eyes that searched for meaning. Wovoka stepped back and reached into his pouch again. This time he offered her something wrapped in soft hide. She opened it slowly to find a single blue stone, polished, glinting in the moonlight, a token, a bond. Tomorrow, he said, voice barely above a whisper. Meet again? Clara looked at the stone, then at him. She nodded. Yes. For the second time in a single lifetime, she had said yes to a man. But this one felt different. This time it felt like choice. The next day dawned heavy with clouds, thick and low, as if the sky itself was reluctant to watch what might unfold. Clara worked through the morning as usual, feeding the chickens, drawing water, mending the fence, but her thoughts were far from chores. The blue stone Wovoka had given her sat hidden in the pocket of her apron, warm against her thigh, like a pulse beating just beneath her skin. By noon, she heard the first whispers on the wind, hoofbeats, distant and slow. She set her bucket down and climbed the back hill again, squinting toward the road. A group of soldiers, 7 in all, rode slowly toward the east ridge, their uniforms dusty, their rifles prominent. They weren't headed for her, not yet. But they were too close. Clara knew enough to understand what their presence meant. Tension was building, and something was about to break. Later, in town, the talk would spread like wildfire. Cheyenne sighted near the Remington land. She's been out there alone too long. Can't trust a woman who won't take help when it's offered. But Clara stayed silent. She didn't go to town. She didn't answer questions. Instead, as dusk settled and the horizon bruised with purple and fire, she rode out to the clearing beyond her land. Wovoka was already there. This time he wasn't alone. A younger man, barely more than a boy, stood beside him, tense, wary, hand near his knife. Clara slowed her horse and dismounted, hands open to show she meant no harm. Wovoka spoke a few quiet words to the boy, who nodded and stepped back, eyes still locked on her. "They're close," she said. "The soldiers." Wovoka's face was unreadable, but his jaw tightened. "We leave soon," he replied. "Farther west, mountains." Clara's breath caught. "Will you be safe there?" His eyes met hers, steady and dark. "Safer than here." They stood in silence, the wind rustling the tall grass around them, like whispers from another time. Then, Wovoka stepped forward, took her hand, and pressed something into it. Another stone. This one red, veined with black. "If you come," he said quietly, "bring this." Clara clutched the stone tightly. She wasn't sure what scared her more, the world she'd always known unraveling, or how deeply she wanted to follow him into the unknown. The morning came harsh and dry, the prairie wind sharp with the scent of coming heat. Clara stood at her porch with the red stone in her palm, turning it slowly between her fingers. Her heart beat in quiet rebellion against the life she had once known. A life built on duty, on silence, on staying put. But something had shifted inside her, something no longer willing to be caged. The news had reached her by noon. The soldiers had questioned the Alcotts, passed through the Miller Ranch, and now they were headed to her land. She had been expecting them. She didn't run. She didn't hide the stone. Instead, she waited. When they arrived, Captain Hale led the small detachment. His voice was clipped and businesslike, eyes roaming over her as if appraising livestock. "We've received reports of suspicious activity on your property, Mrs. Remington. Have you seen any signs of the Cheyenne?" Clara met his gaze without flinching. "No more than usual," she said. It was not a lie, it was not the truth. He narrowed his eyes. "You should understand, harboring savages is a federal offense." The words struck her like gravel in the teeth, not because she feared them, but because she now saw the absurdity of them. Wovoka was more civilized than half the men she'd known in church pews. "I'm not harboring anyone," she said calmly. "I live alone, as is my right." Hale studied her, perhaps sensing resistance that wasn't worth the paperwork. "If you see anything," he said slowly, "you'd be wise to report it. The Army doesn't take kindly to sympathizers." He tipped his hat and turned his horse. The soldiers rode off in a slow cloud of dust. As the trail settled, Clara walked to the edge of her land. She stood there a long time, staring at the open plains, the sky too wide to hold lies. That night, she did not wait for Wovoka in the clearing. She did not return the stone. She packed a small satchel, water, bread, a wrapped keepsake from her mother's trunk, and slipped the stone into the center of it. Just before dawn, she saddled her mare and rode west, past the clearing, past the line where settlers said the world ended, toward the place where her soul had begun to wake. The path westward was raw and unmarked, a trail that belonged to the wind and memory more than any map. Clara rode through dry creek beds and low gullies, the sun carving shadows along her face, her skirts heavy with dust. Hours passed in silence, her thoughts as loud as war drums. Would he be there? Would they still wait? Or had she already been forgotten? Just another settler's wife drifting too far from the safety of fences and flags. By midday, smoke rose again in the distance, not the soft spiral of cooking fires, but black, thick plumes twisting skyward like dying trees. Her stomach clenched. She urged her horse forward. As she crested a ridge, the world unfolded into chaos below. A Cheyenne camp lay in disarray, tents smoldering, goods scattered, warriors moving swiftly to gather what they could. It wasn't a battle. It was a retreat, and she was too late. Panic surged through her, but she pushed her horse down the slope, calling out before she could think. "Wovoka!" Heads turned, arrows notched. For a moment she feared she'd be mistaken for an enemy. Then he appeared, dust-covered, blood smeared across his sleeve, but alive. Their eyes locked. He crossed the chaos to her, his expression unreadable. "You came," he said, the words like an anchor in a storm. "I told you I would." Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Soldiers?" "Soon," he said. "Scouts came this morning. We go to the canyon. It is the last safe place." Clara looked at the fire devouring what had been a home, at the people moving like ghosts through ruin. "Then I go with you." He didn't question her, didn't ask why. He simply nodded and reached for her horse's reins. Together they rode with the others, fathers, mothers, elders, and children, into the wild edge of the world. The wind howled over the prairie behind them, carrying ash and the echoes of gunfire. But ahead the land rose in jagged red cliffs, a place beyond reach, beyond law, beyond everything Clara had ever known. And in that moment, she understood. This was not escape. This was choosing. Not to belong to settlers, to soldiers, or to silence, but to herself. The canyon swallowed them whole, a world carved in stone and shadow, far from the reach of any law Clara had ever known. Towering red walls rose like sentinels on either side, and the air held a strange stillness, as if the land itself was watching. The Cheyenne moved with quiet precision, rebuilding with what little they had salvaged. Children gathered kindling, elders whispered prayers, and Clara, stranger among them, found herself not pushed aside but quietly accepted. No words, no ceremonies, just space made for her. That night, beneath a full and ghostly moon, the firelight danced across the walls. A hush fell over the canyon. Wovoka approached her where she sat near the flames, a carved bowl in his hands, steam curling from its contents. He knelt, placing it before her, a simple stew of roots and game. She took it with gratitude, their eyes locking. "You have no more home," he said softly. It was not a question. She nodded. "Not one I want to return to." He sat beside her, the firelight painting gold along his cheekbone. "In our ways, when someone stays, they are not guest. They are part." His voice was low, his meaning unmistakable. "You do not have to be like us, but you will not be other." She swallowed hard. "And the soldiers? When they find this place?" "Then we leave again," he said. "We always leave. But we remember who walked with us." He pulled a piece of hide from his tunic, unfolded it carefully. Inside, 2 small cuts of rawhide, dyed with ochre and marked with black lines, symbols she didn't understand, but felt. "Blood binds stronger than law," he said, "but only if given freely." He reached into a pouch, drew out a flint blade, and pressed it lightly to his palm, drawing a clean red line. Then he handed it to her. Clara looked at him, at the blade, then at the sky where the stars watched silently. Slowly she took it. Her cut was smaller, but it bled all the same. They pressed palms, skin to skin, and in the moonlight something unseen passed between them. Not just a promise, but a defiance, of borders, of fear, of silence. In that moment she became not just his companion, but his equal. By the time the soldiers reached the canyon, it was empty. They found only cold ashes, a few stone circles where fires had once burned, and footprints half erased by wind. No tents, no people, no sign of battle. Just silence, thick and unyielding. Captain Hale dismounted and scanned the towering cliffs with narrowed eyes. "They were here," he muttered, "not long ago." But time in these lands was a different beast. It didn't care for orders or timetables. It swallowed memories as easily as sand swallowed footprints. And Clara Remington? She was gone. To the settlers, she became a ghost. Some claimed she'd been taken. Others whispered that grief had driven her mad. No one spoke her name with certainty, only in fragments and rumors. The land forgot nothing, but the people did. Somewhere beyond the ridge, past the old hunting trails and the last bend of the river, Clara rode alongside Wovoka and his people, deeper into the wilderness. She had traded fences for sky, mourning cloth for the wind. Her skirts were torn, her skin browned by sun and smoke, her eyes no longer weighed down by what had been expected of her. In this life, there was no room for softness, not the kind that waited to be rescued. But there was space for strength, for a different kind of belonging. They traveled for days, moving under cover of night, resting where the earth folded into itself. Clara learned to listen, not just with her ears, but with her bones. She listened to the animals, the river, the roots. She listened to Wovoka's stories when he chose to share them. And sometimes he listened to hers. One night, in a quiet clearing, he traced a line into the dirt. "When they tell this story," he said, "what will they call you?" Clara thought for a long time. "A traitor," she said, "a fool, a widow gone wild." He nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. "And what will you call yourself?" She looked at him, at the sky, at the world unfolding like a long-forgotten map. Free. No one back east would ever speak her name again without shame or scorn. But here, in a land that owed nothing to the world she'd left behind, Clara Remington would never be forgotten. Because in the firelight, and among the people who had taken her in, she had not disappeared. She had become